Good afternoon and welcome to the eighth and final session of China 101 2020, hosted by the U.S. Asia Institute. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Zev Moses, and I'm the Director of International and Government Affairs at USAI. The U.S. Asia Institute is a nonpartisan, United Nations-affiliated nonprofit with a 41-year track record of building understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This China 101 program would not have been possible without the steadfast support of the House and Senate U.S.-China working groups. Our thanks to them, especially the staff contacts J.Z. Golden, Ashley Ann Toskiewicz, Dan Gehrig, Liz Benicki, and Jed Derkel. A special thanks too for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders, Las Vegas Sands, Merck, Fairfield Maxwell, AIG, Airbnb, and ConocoPhillips. Now on to today's program. This briefing will explore the role that cultural diplomacy plays in U.S.-China relations, how the exchange of American and Chinese cultures connect us, and current tensions in this arena. We are fortunate to have with us today two top experts to lead this briefing. First, I'd like to welcome Chris Fenton. Chris is the CEO of Media Capital Technologies. He previously served as president of DMG Entertainment Motion Picture Group, a global media company headquartered in Beijing. He has produced or supervised 21 feature films that collectively grossed over $2 billion worldwide. As an author, Chris chronicled much of that work in his new book called Feeding the Dragon: Inside the Trillion-Dollar Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. Chris frequently appears as a contributor for Real Clear Politics, Bloomberg, the BBC, CNBC, and Fox Business, among other prominent outlets. Chris is also a trustee at the U.S. Asia Institute. I'd like to make a quick disclaimer that while Chris is connected with USAI, his views and opinions are his own and do not represent the views and opinions of the U.S. Asia Institute. I'd also like to welcome Zach Dykwald. Zach is the founder and CEO of the Young China Group, a market insights firm based in Beijing, dedicated to bridging the world and China. He is also the author of Young China: How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. Zach is a highly sought-after keynote speaker around the world, having spoken at the Wall Street Journal CEO Summit, the Aspen Ideas Festival, and other prominent venues. Finally, Zach is a fluent Mandarin speaker and splits his time living in China and the United States. Today, our speakers will make remarks and host a dialogue on the topic at hand. Then we will take as many of your questions as time allows. To get us started, Chris, take it away.
Just a simple intro of my point of view. Number one is I am a trustee of the U.S. Asia Institute, as Zev has mentioned. In order to be free with my comments today, I want to make sure that I'm not representing the organization, but I will make a great plug for the organization. I've been a member of it since 2013 and started co-hosting on the ground in Beijing delegations of staff members and members back in 2012. It was a fantastic organization, and I highly recommend all of you recommend to your members, to other people on the Hill, to take part in some of these delegation trips once they get up and running. Hopefully they do soon. Number two is I do have a book coming out. It is right behind me because this is where I've been doing a lot of my promotion. I have been on a lot of platforms lately, and the book itself is about the colorful journey of the exchange of culture and commerce between the two superpowers. It shows my passion and drive in regards to that initiative, but then it also shows a bit of my awakening to some of the things that I feel like have to be addressed between the two countries moving forward. I have gotten more hawkish since my last delegation trip to China, which was just prior to the COVID outbreak. We got back in September of last fall. But I will say that my hawkishness does not put me in the realm of wanting full decoupling between the two countries, nor do I want a Cold War. One of the biggest arguments I make in my book, and the biggest arguments I make when I'm on any sort of platform, is the fact that cultural and commercial exchange between the two countries, which I witnessed firsthand, is some of the best glue that keeps differing points of views on different sides of the Pacific together in some sort of diplomatic, call it a strategic competitor mode, or call it just some semblance of harmony which is something that we need to make sure happens no matter how we address the superpower relationship moving forward. I do think something has to occur, but it's also something where we need to find out as a nation, with our leaders, with our policy, with our laws, how we're going to regulate the interaction between the two countries, but do it in a place that does not put us in a Cold War footing or even worse. So that is my point of view. That's some of the stuff we're going to talk about today. And I'm super excited to have Zach on with me, because I felt one thing that we were missing at the Institute, and also something that I'm missing as myself when I talk about the bilateral relationship, is a perspective from a millennial. Millennials and the generations before millennials are facing the longest future ahead of them that's going to involve both countries. So I really wanted Zach to join us. He has a fantastic book called Young China. He lived on the ground in China for 10 years. And his perspective, I think, will make a fantastic, if you want to use yin and yang or Taoism, to this conversation. So Zach, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you everyone for taking the time to tune in today. So I'm just going to do a quick intro here. To Chris's point, I do a lot of focusing on young China. And now when I say young China, I usually am referring to two things. First, young people. So I'm an American millennial. I was born in California, actually. And there's about 80 million American millennials. We're playing a large role in the election coming up. Obviously, our opinion is more and more sought after. And it's increasingly clear how we're going to be defining the future of our country. Again, there's about 80 million of us. There is 417 million young people in China. So more young people in China than there are people in the United States and Canada combined. I actually think the more interesting definition of young China, though, is the second one, which is this idea of a relatively old country reimagining its identity on the world stage today. And particularly in Washington, it's more important now than ever to understand this young generation specifically, distinctly from the older generations in China, because limiting preconceptions, focusing on the older generations in China, often inhibit us from understanding where China's going today, what are their best interests. So they could either be a consumer, competitor, or collaborator, depending on where we are in the political weather. So what I'm going to be describing today is sort of the impact of young China today and going forward, as well as hopefully a framework to help you be more empathetic and understanding to what this young generation wants for themselves, their family, their country, how they see us, how they see the world.
Great, thank you, Zach. Thank you for both of your intros. With that, Chris, I'll just let you go ahead and talk about your viewpoint.
Yeah, so obviously we have an hour here, so there's a lot more nuance to what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to take about 10 minutes here just to talk about a few things that I think are interesting that hopefully will promote some questions from the group. Number one is, when I'd never lived in China. I spent a lot of time in China, but I did the majority of my work out of the Los Angeles base of our company. My job was essentially making sure that North American companies and global companies understood what we were trying to get done on the China side. And that required me essentially living on a plane, moving back and forth between the two countries. But unlike Zach, I never actually lived there. On top of it, I don't read or write Mandarin, and I have a very basic understanding of speaking and listening to it, although I am one heck of a Mandarin karaoke singer. That said, let's talk about it sort of at a macro sense. This is the way I talk about it in the book, because the book is sort of a Michael Lewis colorful journey expose of my 20 years doing business there. So I didn't want to get too experty, but on top of it, China is something where even the experts get overwhelmed as you pull back the onions. So let's just talk about the outside of the onion first, and the most macro perspective that I look at when it comes to China and navigating how to get business done in China or the exchange of culture. Number one is, think about how the ruling class, the leadership there, looks at what their job is. In a very vanilla, possibly hawkish look at it, they want 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't create another Tiananmen Square uprising. That was back in 1989. They've done a very good job of it since. And part of that is to make people just happy enough that they don't want to revolt and that they're content with their leadership. One of the issues with making everybody happy when there's 1.4 billion people is there's just simply not enough resources on Earth to be able to do that. So there's a couple things that they need to do. One is they need to draw in as many people into the middle class, and then with the people that haven't been pulled into the middle class, they need to have all of what they need and maybe potentially some of what they want. Since they started this effort of bringing people into the middle class, and this is the number that they gave us when we were on our last delegation trip, they brought in 600 million people into the middle class. That's unbelievable. And when Zach talks numbers, when you think of that number, that's almost double the size of the United States overall. And they're still working on bringing more and more in. On top of that, if you listen to their sales pitch, they essentially have talked about how they have brought people out of extreme poverty and have given them essentially the bare minimum to make sure that they're just happy enough with their leadership that they keep them in power. One of the things that is involved with that process is that because everybody can't be a part of the middle class, the messaging has to be that people have what they need and they should be content. And the messaging to the people that they can't have is that things that they don't have, they should have, or seeing things that aspire them to get to a place where they're simply not capable of getting a majority of the populace to. And that brings us into how you need to look at getting products and services into that country. Number one is you need to sell why your product or service should be able to get access to that consumer base there. And that sale is to the government itself. You need to explain why it's good for their populace to have access to the product and service, and why it helps their leadership follow the initiative that they have, where keeping 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt is met. So when we look at, for instance, the movie business, and you look behind me, I have Iron Man 3 poster back there. So Zev, if you can actually put up like a couple of those photos from Iron Man 3, I'll walk through what I'm talking about here. So one thing about China is that they follow the old US playbook in regards to getting themselves from a developing country into a developed country. And that involves quotas and tariffs and different other protectionist policies. Hollywood is obviously beholden to a lot of those things itself, as are most other industries out of the US. In terms of China, back when we got Iron Man 3 in, only 20 films from the outside world were allowed into the China market. And out of those 20 films, they only received 13 to 17% of the box office gross that was made in the China market. So as you can see, there were quotas and protectionist policies put in. For us to try to navigate around those, we wanted to figure out a way to sell to the Chinese leadership that the movie Iron Man 3 had a lot of what they needed in order to satisfy that agenda of making 1.4 billion people just happy enough. So part of that was, if you look at that one photo there, Wang Keshi, he was one of the Chinese actors that was in that particular movie. When we pitched to the Chinese Iron Man 3, we said, not only are we going to utilize some of your infrastructure on the ground in China, meaning below the line crews, et cetera, we're going to shoot in China. We're going to showcase China. As you can see, that's one of the 9 gates surrounding Beijing. We're actually going to bring Iron Man to China, which, by the way, under that mask is not Robert Downey Jr. It's a stuntman, but we brought Iron Man there. And we're actually going to use their artists. On top of it, when we come out to promote the movie, we're actually going to do something that had never been done before. We're going to do a full-blown Hollywood-style premiere. And we're not going to just do a Hollywood-style premiere. We're going to do it on national television, and we're going to shoot it inside the center of China. And as you know, Beijing is essentially the center of China, because there are no time zones in China. Whatever time it is in Beijing, it's the same time around China. And the center of Beijing, inside the first ring road, is the Forbidden City, which is where we actually had the premiere for that. And even better, we showcased to China that we were going to bring one of the biggest global stars in the world to China, because he wanted to be in China and wanted to meet the people of China, because those are fans that he really cares about. So if you look at the different relevancy that we created there for the government, it was easy to see why they supported that movie. And the result was the largest movie ever for Marvel in that market prior to our deal with Iron Man 3 was a whopping $20 million. Iron Man 3 came out, we made $125 million in that country alone. And to date, Marvel is the most valuable entertainment IP on earth in that market. The last Marvel movie did $650 million, the last Avengers film, in that market. So you can see creating relevancy and a reason for the government to support your product and service then allows you the next step, which is access to their consumer to be able to market and promote it. The Looper slide, please. We did the same thing just prior to Iron Man 3 with a smaller movie called Looper. Looper was a movie that actually took place 40 years in the future for about half of the movie. That film, we actually pitched to the Chinese government that we wanted to make Shanghai the center of the world as far as a global city. The city that everybody wanted to live in, the city that Joseph Gordon-Levitt, when he retired one day as a gangster, would move there. And in fact, we worked with the Chinese municipal government in Shanghai to design that skyline, that futuristic skyline, which you see in that storyboard there, so that it showcased their city the way they wanted to see it. And in fact, the models for that actual skyline are still in the Shanghai City Hall today. The result of that, Looper, which should have been censored and not even allowed into the country because of things like time travel, criminal activity on the ground in China, drug use, etc. All of that was overlooked. We were allowed to market to the consumer, and it was a top 10 movie that year. Final slide there, Zev. And I just wanted to showcase something that wasn't in the movie business, but something I talk about in the book, and something that relates to another industry, which is the sports industry. As you know, NBA has huge, huge cachet and a huge, huge revenue source that's growing by the minute prior to the Daryl Morey tweet last fall in that market. Nike, the same way. All of Nike's growth comes from the China market. And like I showed with Iron Man 3, we did a thing called the Battle of the Nine Gates to promote Nike back in 2005, where we had a national 3-on-3 tournament that culminated in the best teams around the country playing inside the Forbidden City. And each team represented one of the ancient 9 gates of China. If you go to the one final slide there, Zev. That's one of the gates. Actually, a lot of the gates, if you know Beijing well, were destroyed in order to build the subway system there. But the areas around the old gates all have a very strong community situation where people have a lot of pride in them. So we actually took 9 teams and had each one represent the gates. They competed inside the Forbidden City, and Nike's value, and as far as their revenues, jumped massively that particular year, and it's been on an escalation in an exponential way ever since. So that's sort of my 10-minute overview of the cultural and commercial exchange between the two countries and the importance to look at it in particular ways. Zach, why don't you take it now?
Thanks so much, Chris. So for my 10 minutes, I do want to talk about particularly the millennial generation, their viewpoint, their interaction with the West, and how they've been informed by sort of the other in their lives. Most young people in China have grown up hearing about the United States from their parents. And so this cultural bridge between the US and China has been a constant feature of their daily lives for their entire lives. there's actually more English speakers. There's over 300 million people learning English in China right now. I have friends who have taken about between 10 and 15 years of English. They're very familiar with our history. They're familiar with our music. They've grown up watching our TV. And so there is a little bit of an understanding deficit between the United States and China. I joke that I have friends who can quote Martin Luther King Jr. and Barney from How I Met Your Mother in the same sentence with the same level of fluency. And so that level of awareness is something that I'm hoping is going to increase on our end, but is also invaluable when we talk about apolitical interaction between the United States and China. When we're looking at the interests of both countries, it sort of makes sense that from a political standpoint, there is inevitably going to be clashes. And to Chris's point, and sort of what we're doing here today is, I actually think the greatest opportunity for stronger relationship between the United States and China is both cultural and commercial. Cultural being a vehicle, or the commercial being a vehicle for the cultural. So just as basics, I'm going to share a few slides. They're going to show some numbers. And then I'm going to tell you a story, and then we're going to get into Q&A. Okay, so I am going to try to share my screen here. Zev, can you nod if you can see this? Perfect. Okay, so this question of how is young China impacting us today, impacting the US today, for context, and I hinted at this before, but there are actually more young people in China than there are young people in North America, the European Union, and the Middle East combined. And we focus a lot on these two different versions of China. One is government, which is typically scary. One is economic, which used to be exciting and now is increasingly scary. But we don't really think about how different generations actually play a role in that economic contribution. So just to look into that, this is what the world's top tourism spenders look like in 2019. You can see that China is actually already the largest outbound tourism spender. And they've also grown far and away the most in the last decade. And 2/3 of all passport holders within China right now are actually millennials. So this one generation within China is actually currently single-handedly redefining global travel. We've seen how passports can be increasingly weaponized politically. So this is something to keep in mind, that a lot of our allies and other countries that we're working with around the country are going to be around the world, are increasingly considering. International students in the United States, this has been a big issue recently. We've learned that our education is a lot of things. One of the things that it is a business. And China is far and away our largest customer. So over 1/3 of our students are from China. India and China combined actually make up 52% of all of our students coming from the international world and studying here in the United States. And just something to think about, and I'm sure this is a question that's going to come up, why is it that a country like China, who's so obsessed with the mental diet of its nation, encourage the wealthiest, best, brightest students to come to the United States, theoretically the political enemy, and learn from some of our best institutions in the world? Just something to consider, and we can talk about later. Retail is increasingly important. So China actually delivered more than half of the global growth in luxury spending, 2012 to 2018. They're expected to make 3/4 of global luxury growth, which is why you're increasingly seeing global brands, including American brands, pivoting to understand China. By 2025, they're expected to be around 40% of the entire market. And at this point, probably unsurprisingly, 79% of luxury spend is done by those between 20 and 40. And so when we look at where we're at today, this is the world. China is currently 19% of our global GDP, compared with 17 years ago where they were just under 4%. And so when I describe young China, I'm not talking about something that might happen. We're not talking about something that could take place or is beginning to sort of rear its head. This is already happening. And my biggest concern is what I hinted at earlier, which is an understanding deficit between what we believe matters to China and what is actually discussed within China about mattering to them. And so to help offer a framework, when we talk about China speed, we typically imagine buildings. Have you ever considered the psychological impact of growing up in a place like China that has changed as much as it has changed. Just to put this into context, so my dad was born in 1950. He's from New Jersey originally. He went to Woodstock in 1969. This is the United States in 1969. Woodstock was best known for three things: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. This was China in 1969. I think we often forget what this looks like. This generation was best known for their ability to 吃苦, to eat bitter, to do difficult things for long periods of time at the prospect of delayed gratification. This is the generation that first began to hear about the United States. The slogans of the time were 超英赶美, surpass England, catch up with the United States. And it's that idea of the other, the sort of city on the hill, passed on from the older generations that grew up during the Cultural Revolution, that have informed a lot of the younger generation's idea of what the United States is, which is typically, again, a city on a hill. We can talk about how that's shifting over these last 5 or 10 years. When I talk about China speed, this I find is a really helpful metric for understanding change. So in my lifetime, I've watched, again, American millennial, I've watched our per capita GDP, which is general growth or quality of life, increase 2.5 times since I was born. So maybe education, 2.5 times better. The trips we could take as a family, 2.5 times longer. You know, the hedges on my neighbors, 2.5 times higher. However you want to imagine it, try to imagine it personally. If you're born in China that same year, 1990, you've watched your per capita GDP increase 31 times. Maybe it's just a developing country thing. What about India? Massive millennial population, also developing country, BRICS nation. Just over 5x. Germany, leader of Europe, 1.9. Brazil, another BRICS nation, 3.2. In fact, when you look at the rest of the world, this is how much growth millennials have seen in their life. And there's something in common, which is it's mostly the same, with one exception. So when we think about how this young generation in China sees their country, sees us, sees growth, understands innovation, what their expectations are for shifting social norms, the one thing we most often overlook is that our world, most of the world, moves at a certain pace, and their ecosystem, their mental, their environment growing up is a full order of magnitude faster than the rest of the world. This is Shanghai in 1990, this is Shanghai in 2015. What would living through that growth do to your expectations around change, growth, government? And I want to finish with a story here, so I'm going to stop sharing. The very first time a lot of my friends in China, some of the people I wrote about, ever saw the United States was in 1996, during the Atlanta Olympics. I have a friend in Sichuan province who remembers his mother taking him out of the house when he was 6 years old and bringing him to his uncle's place. They had a boxy black and white TV, but my friend, his name is Xiao Wen, did not have a TV at all. So this was big news for them. He remembers his mom tapping him on the shoulder and saying, "Look, there's the United States. It's the most powerful country in the world," 1996. He remembers that year, the United States won, I believe it was 44 gold medals when China won 15. 15 wasn't bad at the time. China's per capita GDP was about $400, so not really supporting a robust athletics department. Fast forward to 2008. I'm sure a lot of you remember the Beijing Olympics. We think of that opening ceremony as the coming out party of China, sort of Beijing beating its chest and saying it's powerful, coordinated, gliding towards the future. What we often forget is the government has two audiences, and they were also telling with that opening ceremony, the young generation and their parents in China, that this is the new version of China. We are powerful, we are coordinated, and we are gliding into the future. So my friend Xiao Wen, he was 6 in 1996, now he's 18, remembers watching Beijing that year and the Beijing Olympics. He remembers watching China win 48 gold medals and the United States winning 36. How much is a gold medal worth? It's not much. But what about pride? When we talk about cultural diplomacy in China, we end up talking a lot about nationalism. And nationalism is going up around the world, but certainly in China, and certainly to a certain extent in the United States. one thing that we have to keep in mind is it's not just government. It's not just propaganda. And the lived experience, in the United States right now, there's a lot of conversations about how different citizens have different lived experiences. That informs our worldview. In China, there's a young generation who feels like their lived experience has validated a worldview that is more forgiving towards Beijing and towards the government than what many of us would like them to feel. And as we talk about, as this call progresses, young generation's perspective on the United States and China, we should keep their lived experience in mind, because that drives perception to a far greater degree than most of us give credence to. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Zach, and thank you, Chris, for giving an overview of your perspectives and your insight and telling some great anecdotes. So I want to get into just some questions for discussion here. And Chris, if you're ready, I'd like to start with you. There are a ton of, actually hundreds, I think over 350 bills introduced in Congress that address China. And I want to pick out one, just given your expertise. What do you think of Senator Ted Cruz's recent legislation to enact restrictions on government assistance to films that alter themselves to fit Chinese censorship restrictions? I just want to get your thoughts on something like that.
Well, it's a great question, and it's one that has been asked quite a bit. Just really quick, going back to Zach's great brief there, over 10 minutes. He used a lot of amazing stats, and just to put it in the business that I've been in the last 20 years, Hollywood, he talked about the great coming out of the 2008 Olympics. At that point, when 2009 came online that year, China eventually got 5,000 movie screens operating, and a lot of them were still like pachinko parlors in third-tier cities that were turned into movie theaters on Saturday nights. Cut to today, there's 70,000. So that's yet another interesting statistic. And also back then, they were struggling to make 200 million in gross in a single year. Now they're going to overtake the US, and they've broken the $10 billion mark. So that's how fast that market's growing. Ted Cruz obviously is looking at Hollywood in a way where Hollywood's just one of the many industries that's looking at growth and going, well, how do we get to that consumer base? And Hollywood has been just as guilty of what they want to call pandering or kowtowing to the Chinese government as a lot of the critics have said the NBA is. In regards to Ted's bill, I do agree with it in certain ways, and I differentiate from it from others. But the place where I want to focus is the fact that we do have a relationship between two countries that are very different in a lot of ways. I look at it sort of the two superpowers, almost like a cell phone and a cell tower. To have great communication or great diplomacy occurring between those two countries, you need 5 bars of service. I call them Fenton's 5 forces of diplomacy, which would be politics, national security, human rights, culture, and commerce. I think at this point in the game, and I wrote an op-ed for Real Clear Politics recently, it's time to agree to disagree on some of those forces. One is politics. I think we made a mistake believing that we were eventually going to get their leadership to decide on being a democracy like the West. Human rights, we obviously have heard a lot of the differences of opinions there. And then national security, we're obviously now seeing China spread their wings in the South China Sea and other areas. So that leaves us with culture and commerce. Part of culture, I believe, is the right of freedom of speech. It's the right to create art and content that is an ability to express certain freedoms. One thing that Hollywood has been guilty of recently is being allowed to be censored cross-border by China. And that's where I see eye to eye with Ted Cruz. We should have a right in this country to create content or to speak on behalf of the things that we feel are principles and values that we hold dearly as Americans. We should be allowed to do that on our soil. We should be allowed to do that off of China's soil in other parts of the world where those freedoms are allowed also. That goes for content too. The place that I have a real issue, and where Ted Cruz also does, is the fact that China is telling us not just to censor the content for within their borders, which I am fine with. I mean, obviously, it would be great if we didn't have to, but we do the same thing for Japan, for Korea, the Middle Eastern countries, etc. It's just the price of doing business in those countries. Where I have the issue is where China asks Hollywood, through some sort of strong influential force, to alter the content for the rest of the world to see. And Ted Cruz cites a couple different examples, one of which is the Top Gun movie, where the Taiwanese flag had been removed from the jacket that Tom Cruise wears. It's one thing for it to be removed for inside the country's borders of China, because China does not recognize Taiwan as a separate country or a one country, two systems situation with its own flag. Outside of China, though, people in Argentina, people in Germany, people in Peoria, Illinois, or wherever else should be able to see that flag on the jacket as the way the filmmakers have intended. So the idea of trying to force through some sort of legislation that allows all players in Hollywood to back each other with that creative freedom and the ability to do it, hopefully will allow us to have the leverage so retaliation doesn't occur on the China side. If it's just one studio or one filmmaker taking a stand, it will just be a sacrificial lamb situation. But if the whole industry and others, quite frankly, like the NBA, et cetera, are allowed to have that freedom of speech, to speak up about the differences we have with politics, the differences we have with national security issues, the differences we have with human rights, that makes a much more natural human interaction. We're not always going to agree, but we should be able to talk about that stuff on our own soil. So I do like some of the idea behind that bill, and I hope that expresses it in some sort of cognizant way. And obviously, I'm happy to address it even further with Q&A.
Thanks, Chris. Zach, did you want to jump in at all on that question? I have some more for you, so happy to ask you a different one.
It can be really quick, and this will likely cut through a lot of our ideas that we're talking about today. I cannot stress this enough, that from the United States point of view, in terms of what our interests are, which are increasingly hoping to a certain extent that China and this young generation in particular adopt certain democratic principles and values as a part of their core ethos and approach to the world. I cannot stress enough how the biggest threat to the government is a democracy functioning at its highest level. It's an exemplary alternative to what they're experiencing. And one of the greatest veins of information about what other life can be like is our media. And so if we're looking to have a population that's sympathetic to the United States, it's very unlikely that they're going to do it through headlines, because so much of the headlines and the media that is actually actively controlled by the CCP is adversarial to the United States, and they benefit from the worse we look. Whereas the media that we at least have a control in and ensure it gets filtered out at the end is an opportunity to show versions of the United States. And I'm not even talking about sort of hero villain, something as simplistic as that, but to show versions of the United States that are human, approachable, and to a certain degree admirable. So versions of the United States that are not just the news-driven, news cycle, calamity-oriented, which is news everywhere. So something to keep in mind, the more positive versions of the United States that people can see that are apolitical will dilute what is a fairly serious and consistent stream of negative news.
Right, thank you for that, Zach, and thank you, Chris. I love when you talk about those 5 bars of service. I think that is a really good way to look at what we're talking about. Switching gears just a little bit, Zach, you had talked about, COVID and its effects, and you talk a lot about people-to-people exchanges and study abroad programs and student exchanges. How do you think travel limitations, could impact young Chinese and American students in understanding one another? We've seen a drop in Chinese students coming to the U.S. to study anyway. So, what do you make of the effects of COVID and that general trend?
Sure. So we've seen a slight decrease in Chinese admissions or applications and admissions, frankly, to the United States schools, but they're still far and away the biggest customer, if you will, for our education. And if we believe that experiencing our way of life is sort of the best advertisement for it, cutting people out is the surest way to slight people. So there are large swaths of the population in China that will never ever be able to go to the United States, and only 9% of the population actually has a passport at all. So something to keep in mind. Despite China already being the largest outbound tourism spender in the world, only 9% of the population has a passport. It's a number that's expected to double in the next 5 years, but you're still talking about a relatively privileged cut of the population. So I truly believe that the more person-to-person experience, or even the more experience that isn't adversarial and politically driven, which is so much of the information that goes in both to the United States about China and to China about the United States, we're really cutting off one of our greatest diplomatic opportunities. And the way that I think about it is that the United States looks a lot better up close than from far away. If you look at the experience of being in the United States over the last several months during COVID, versus the experience of being in the United States that my friends back in China are asking me about every morning, being like, because it looks tough when you look at the numbers. When you're actually here and you can see some of the empathetic response from people, and the more you can humanize what's actually happening on the ground, the stronger relationships are. I'm from California, so this might color a little bit of my attitudes here, but good relationships are based on understanding. And if you close the door before someone can even get in, but you're also asking them to sort of envy what you have here, it's not going to inspire feelings of admiration and friendliness, which is ultimately what we're hoping for. Because again, this is a decades-long trend going forward as China increasingly is a more powerful consumer and competitor on the world stage. So closing the door now on the generation that will be guiding China's powerful step going forward, to me is a misstep and missing the opportunity to show our best selves to a country that's been brought up interested in us.
Yeah, Zev, I'll just interject on what Zach was saying there. In my experience with the U.S. Asia Institute, just putting that hat on for a second, I never witnessed a staff member or a member coming back from one of those trips more hawkish or more negative towards China. At the very least, they stay neutral from before they got on the plane and went over there. But 9 times out of 10, maybe even more, they become more understanding and they have a better perspective at how to formulate policy and legislation for the two superpowers in this bilateral relationship moving forward. In fact, on the last trip that I did, we brought over 3 members. And prior to it, there was a lot of negative rhetoric going on between the two countries because of the Hong Kong situation. And one of the members was tweeting quite a bit about it. And I can tell you, when they got back from China, the tweeting definitely was mitigated quite a bit, and an understanding of sort of the complexities behind what was going on in Hong Kong and China overall really allowed that member to sort of get a different perspective going back to the Hill. So yes, human to human contact, so important. I always go back to all you have to fear is fear itself, that great quote. I'm probably messing it up a little bit, but when you actually are encountering the other side and get that perspective, yes, of course, you're not always going to agree with them, and you're definitely not going to believe some of the stuff that they say. But on top of it, you do have that human to human contact, and it's always beneficial or neutral at worst. It is never something that creates a worse relationship or a worse perspective.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think you both bring, a great perspective to address that question. Switching gears just a little bit, and then just a reminder for everyone in attendance, feel free to chat me a question directly or send it to everyone, and we'd be happy to address that. But just moving forward, Chris, there's a lot of talk about, decoupling between China and the United States. What are the implications of, economic decoupling on, cultural exchanges and cultural diplomacy?
Well, I'll go back to what Zach said about headlines. I feel like this word decoupling is used to generate clickbait and headlines on both sides of the Pacific. It's a brutally raw and disruptive word that is completely unrealistic too. I mean, the only way I could see us fully decoupling from the 30 years of rampant globalism we've created between the two countries is to actually go to war. There is just way too much value between the two countries with various trade initiatives and other cooperative strategies that would be too difficult to untangle in a full decoupling. Now, where I agree with decoupling is if you look at it like a two-way street. There's certain east to west, with China being on the east, decoupling I would like to see. There are national security interests and obviously medical issues that we've realized in having our supply chain in China and obviously other countries around the world, but a lot of them in China. We need to decouple from that type of national security interest, supply chain problem that we have in the healthcare side of things, and also in the national security, where we're seeing that in tech and so on. We've also done a really bad job of allowing the health of our middle class to maintain a nice status with as we move into the future with our country. I would like to see some of the higher skilled, higher paid jobs come back to the US so we can make a more healthy middle class and a stronger labor part of this country. In regards to decoupling from west to east, I'm very against it because, as Zach said, I mean, the more product and service that gets into that country the right way. I mean, we got to make trade fair. We got to get them from developing to developed country status on the WTO. We need to have the SEC scrutinize their accounting for access to our US capital markets the way we do everybody else. We need to start recognizing quota and protectionist policies that are now long overdue to get overhauled. We need to change that stuff. But once we get through that disruptive reset, we do need to keep pushing the idea of getting products and services into that country. A couple reasons. One is there's great value in it for the country here. If we're making stuff that they're buying, there's GDP growth, and there's revenues that come in from China back to the US. But like Zach was saying too, every product and service that gets into that market from the West brings an aspirational cultural quality to it, or some other influence, soft power influence, that allows that younger generation to aspire more and more towards a government that might become a little more like the West than it is today. Every time a kid wears a pair of Nike sneakers, or is playing basketball like their favorite NBA player, or is sitting in a movie theater watching one of Hollywood's big blockbusters, or is at a Starbucks drinking a Starbucks cup, that little seepage of soft power is super important. And whether you're a hawk and you want to see that as a soft power weapon, or you're a dove and you see it as a tool for diplomacy, I don't care. It has the same ending to it. And that's something we really need to focus on as a country.
Great, thank you, Chris. Zach, do you want to touch decoupling at all, or I'd be happy to move on?
Sure, I'll do it quickly, or I'll do my best. I said that last time and lied. So, but the succinct version is more or less this. The more that we isolate ourselves from China, the richer the environment we're creating for homegrown nationalism within China. This is what we often overlook, but sort of the more we're spurning China, the more that we're not allowing our products to go in or allowing people to come travel here, the more that we shut the door on China, the richer the environment we're creating for nationalism and propaganda within China, without any pressure valve, which is what access to the outside world has increasingly been. And so if our goal, we should just be cognizant of what our best interests are, which are not to inspire more nationalism and more buy-in towards the government. I've actually seen since COVID, it was the largest questioning of CCP that I've seen in the last decade. But the more that we sort of sink into this adversarial invective, the easier it is for the government to cement its position in the hearts and minds of the people. And so more isolation breeds more nationalism within China.
Gotcha. And you've talked a lot about, today we've talked a lot about, increased consumption of Western culture and consumer goods in China. Zach, you spent a lot of time on the ground in China. Has this, increase in consumption changed the perception of the United States or Americans, for people in China? Are there generational gaps in these perceptions? And is the Chinese public, open to this sharing of cultures, or, are there portions of the population that view it as a loss of Chinese culture?
There are massive generational gaps in China in general, and definitely in terms of perception of the United States. So the older generations have this extraordinarily aspirational perception of the United States. It was the goal towards which they were striving. It was what all the work was for. It was part of government slogans. It was explicitly a target towards which they were driving, be it in the Cultural Revolution, but then in the manufacturing area of 80s, 90s, early 2000s. And even still, it is very much the other to China, the competitive other, the aspirational other. But no one from the older generations could come here for the most part. Most people weren't leaving the province, let alone the country. And so it was a city on a hill in its stature as well as distance. This young generation is a little bit different. They've grown up with the internet, which is certainly censored, but they've grown up watching our TV, watching our movies, which of course has come up a lot today, watching the NBA, gaining fluency in English. This idea that it's a perfectly censored environment, it's not at all. And so they have a far more detailed view of the United States. And unfortunately, it has led to a little bit of a disillusionment compared to the perfect version of the US that their parents were described. With that being said, it's become more realist. And this young generation in particular is integrating, we sort of had this idea of Westernization, that's our goal. It's not happening with this young generation. And this idea that they're just going to become like us is not what we've seen in the tiger economies in East Asia. It's not where we've seen most places in the whole Asian theater. But you are having this sort of East-West combination. This exposure to the outside world has shown a lot of this young generation things that they love, that they absolutely want to integrate, that they particularly views around gender, around marriage, around love. These are aspects of Chinese culture that were not ready for modernization, and Western examples have led the way in that. There's also aspects of their culture that they're increasingly proud of. 10 years ago, it used to be foreign was better kind of no matter what. That era has sort of shifted. And so this new question, and this is where you've seen a lot of backlash in the last year or two, because frankly, China's been doing it relatively inelegantly. This new question of what does it mean to be cool with Chinese characteristics? What's the modern version of that? Because right now, Beijing is sort of forcing this like Beijing opera version of China. Like, oh, everything that was old and good about China is what should be cool today. A lot of the young generation is sort of rejecting that, but they're creating a modern version that's a blend of what they've heard outside. It's a blend of what they've grown up on, and then it's an addition, and they're, putting it together through some cultural alchemy and creating something entirely new. So the influence from the West is massive. When you get 200 million people watching a show like 中国有嘻哈 or the Rap of China, I mean, rap is not from the Hutongs in Beijing. It's a Western idea. And so this mixing of story and narrative from East and West is happening at scale right now in China with massive influence from the United States that has certainly informed this young generation's sense of self, sense of future, sense of purpose.
Yeah, I mean, just to elaborate on how they're making their own culture and content that is satisfying their demand for sort of world-class product. I mean, when we got into the movie business right around the end of the Olympics, a almost 90 cents of every dollar generated by movies in that market was from Hollywood films. Now Hollywood's fighting for maybe 30 to 35% of the market share. So it's changed drastically. And that's because they've really caught up to speed on how to make their own local language content that not only satisfies them relevancy wise, but also satisfies them quality wise. So you really have this interesting sort of dynamic where, yes, they do have a lot of excitement about Western aspirational goods and services and things that we have, but there also is a contentment for what they have in China. And as they look at the way both countries are led, I would argue there's a fair amount of very smart people that have access beyond the firewall of what's going around the world and still are okay and actually enjoy being a part of China. So that idea of they're going to come our way no matter what, I think is a little bit of a dinosaur. But that said, I feel like the more we keep avoiding full decoupling and the more we see an opportunity for China with a reset bilateral relationship, for sure. I mean, we need to change it. But as long as we keep our eye on the prize of continuing to do things that are America first, but looking at China as an opportunity, we will slowly win over the hearts and minds of that young generation, at least to a point where they soften the form of government or maybe the hawkishness on the China side towards the US. But it's going to be a process, and it's something we got to put a lot of concerted effort into.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And, I'm just looking at the time right now, and, I see it's 1:59. The hour flew by very quickly. Do you guys have any, just closing comments, pieces of advice? We have a lot of policymakers on the call today. I don't want to put you on the spot, but just seeing if you had any, closing comments or anything. I know we had a lot more questions, and unfortunately we won't be able to get to those.
Well, and I know we have a lot of senior staff members on here, maybe a handful of members, but one of the things that I would really push is let's avoid the soapbox grandstanding of saying, China's bad or decoupling or evil, blah, 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 just to get headlines. There are a lot of major issues between the two countries and a lot of things we need to address on an America First initiative. But I really like the idea of, if you're going to call things out, let's have a solution in mind, or at least let's suggest potential solutions, because calling it out is definitely something that needs to be done. It needs to be spoken about. I'm a squeaky wheel in Hollywood. In fact, there was a Los Angeles Times article today where I'm calling out Hollywood for essentially kowtowing and hiding their heads in the sand in regards to things that are happening there, and we need to address it. And I'm sure I didn't make a lot of friends today by saying that, but the fact is we need to talk about it. This can't be a third rail issue anymore. But part of that discussion has to involve solutions, policies, laws, rules for the road that are going to allow for a practical way forward in this bilateral relationship. If we just grandstand and create negative rhetoric between these two countries, the relationship is going to deteriorate more and more, and we're going to end up moving into a Cold War scenario, which only escalates into something worse. And that's not good for any of us, hawk or dove.
Thank you, Chris. Zach, do you have any closing comments, for our audience here?
Absolutely. So first, it's a total honor and privilege to be able to present for all of you. So thank you for the opportunity. I would really hone in on this idea that the biggest sort of advertisement for the United States and our way of life is for us to be exemplary on the world stage. The converse of that is our failures, things that are perceived as aggression, issues with our government, are fodder for what's become an increasingly nationalist trend within China. And so with a lot of these policy positions, I don't think we necessarily consider that the more we push China away, the easier it is for them to make the case against us to their people. Because we're not just speaking of Beijing, we're speaking to the country of China, whose primary exposure to us is either through our media or through their state media. So if we're increasingly making it just their state media, we are creating we're essentially shutting the door on an echo chamber that doesn't serve our best interests. And so it's not just a nice thing to do to have this sort of cultural diplomacy. It isn't an extra, it's essential, especially as this young generation continues to grow, continues to take primary and leadership roles in both government and business. I really can't stress enough how it'll be an essential part of the US interest for the decades to come.
Great, thank you, Zach and Chris, for your excellent insight, providing your expertise to this really diverse audience that we have here with us today. I know you're both very busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, prepare your remarks, and put together some great slides. And thank you to everyone who's on the call right now. We really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. Just a final, couple notes before we adjourn the session. The briefing was recorded. I saw a lot of people call in halfway through the briefing. So if you missed part of the presentation or have colleagues that were not able to attend, we'll send out a link to the recording of this briefing. For those congressional staffers, you can email china101@usasiainstitute.org to confirm your attendance for your professional development certificate. You should expect to receive those certificates if you attended at least 4 of these sessions by email over the next week or so. I'd like to thank our corporate stakeholders one last time: Las Vegas Sands, Merck, Fairfield Maxwell, AIG, Airbnb, and ConocoPhillips. And unfortunately, this was the last session of the U.S. Asia Institute's China 101 briefing series. Thank you to everyone who joined us throughout the summer for this important and timely program. I could not have imagined a better 2 speakers to conclude this series on a high note and give us a greater insight into the U.S.-China relationship. While China 101 has concluded, USAI continues its mission to improve understanding and strengthen ties between the U.S. and Asia. So stay tuned, for future programs and briefings. And Zach and Chris, thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. An honor. And thank you, Mary Sue, for running the Institute with the fantastic colleagues of yours there. And Zev, you're a fantastic moderator. And Zach, very humbled you joined us today too. And thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you for joining us. The next USAI event is this Wednesday at 9 a.m. on Hong Kong. Thank you.